Right, the topic for today, we've been going along the theme of hip flexors, and the topic for today is what you can do to work with hip flexors. We all tend to have trouble with releasing hip flexors that might be tight or they might be overactive. So what I'll do is go through some techniques that you can do to release hip flexors, some techniques you can do to test strength in the hip flexors, and then also some things that can start strengthening up some weak hip flexors. I've come in to do a little bit on the reformer and things as well, but a lot of it will still be very, very mat orientated. So we've discussed that your hip flexors, so your deeper ones, are coming from the base of your thoracic vertebra, so the last thoracic vertebra, down along the central line and into the lesser tubercle of your femur, and then your iliacus comes around, inserts, and they're the ones that are your deep hip flexors, so they're lifting the hip up. You also then have your quads muscle that come from across the knee and up insert into your ASIS. You've got your pectineus, you've got your tensor fasciae lata, and your sartorius muscle, which goes from there into the thing, and that's your talar sit muscle. So they're the ones that will help and assist as well. So generally when we're looking at differentiating, I will generally say your deep hip flexors are things like your psoas, so your iliopsoas muscle, where the others we'd refer to as your more superficial ones. Okay, so when you're seeing things jump in, we're talking about the superficial hip muscles, so the superficial hip flexors instead. Okay, what I'm going to go through today is, you guys did the Thomas test. So with your Thomas test, if I just put this down, your Thomas test is when we're looking at holding one leg in and letting that leg go over the edge of the bed. If the knee is high, it assumes that your hip flexor is tight. If the leg isn't at 90 degrees at the ankle and it's sticking out, it assumes your quad's tight. So if you've got a high hip and a big angle, it's more likely to be hip flexors and quads. If your hip's down and your quads are long, as in your angle is greater than 90, it's the quads. If your quads are at 90 but your hip's here, then it's more likely to be hip flexors. So that's your sort of baseline test, and you know, a lot of the time I might just take a picture. So if I'm not noting it down, I might take a picture so I've got a quick reference point. In terms of being able to then release those muscles, if you're deciding that what you want to do is some release, then it might be that you give the client some stretches, some traditional style stretches. It might be that you do some release like we were talking about on the floor. So what I'm looking at here is the ball is where my hip flexor is. So it's in that outer edge here, and I pop the ball on there and I'm releasing it more as I lean down, and that's going to be more my superficial hip flexors that I'm working at. I find the sore spot and then release it through here. If I'm looking at iliacus, then I'm looking at inside that pelvic bowl. So if I've got my hand on the hip, it's where my fingers would sit inside and in front of or medial to the bone. And I move through there and again down and around the pelvic bowl, which again is a bit nasty. And then your psoas is coming from the base, so above, just underneath the xiphoid, anywhere down that line, just medial to either side. And then you're lying over the top. Now, if they're up, just be aware that they're on a stretch already. But if they're down, where they're not on a stretch, it's actually a lot more pressure. So you can do either, or you know, clients will do either. It depends what's comfortable for them. They might want something softer to start with than something harder and bigger. And then obviously you can use a roller on here. So if you look back at the video on releasing hip flexors, that will give you some more info and a bit more in depth in how we do that. In terms of actually test strengthening your hip flexors, what we're looking at is how strong are your hip flexors. Now we all know that they lift the knee up. So two ways to test them. is literally a straight leg raise. Can they do a straight leg raise? And higher up is going to bias your hip flexor component. Lower down is going to bias your quads. Okay, so here, if you then resist at that height, you're getting more hip flexors. The other way to do it is just at 90 degrees and resisting static here. Okay, so if you're doing the short lever version, just holding. If you're doing the long lever version, holding and resisting here. For the quads, obviously, you're a little bit lower quads, or you could do resistance through the front of the shin to do a traditional quad. And then what you're doing is comparing it to the opposite side. What you're looking at from a strength point of view, if you're using 0 to 5 as grading, is 5 is full strength. If they can do it against resistance, it's 4 out of 5, and then it's against gravity with gravity, and that's your lower grade. So we're looking at 4 out of 5 is maybe not quite as full strength, 5 out of 5 is equal to your other side, if you're looking at that as equal to grading. So you've got your baseline of which muscle's tight or which muscle's short, and you might want to release that. You've also got your baseline of which muscle is weak. Is it quads or is it hip flexors? So now we're going to go through how you might want to strengthen those. So for those of you who have a reformer, and I always tell clients off for doing that, so lift the teeth on the machine a bit. Yep. If you have people that are using the reformer, you might find just for some release work that just stretching and working through as a bit of a stretch from hip flexors. So if you've done your traditional scooter and you drop the knee down and ease into it, it's a very nice sort of stretch. As long as they don't do that and hang, as long as they've got some support through their tummy. So what's happening is they're not just going and letting the joint pop. So what happens when you do that and just hang is that the joint's just sitting forwards. You want to make sure there's still a bit of control in there, so you tuck the tail underneath, which means that you get a posterior tilt of your pelvis, and then you'll feel that the joint is supported, but you'll also then feel a hip flexor stretch. Here, you're just going to see it hanging. If I pop over to the other side, that might be a bit easier for you to see. So if I'm here and I'm just hanging off my joint, you can see my back's really arched, my hips just hanging. Whereas if I tuck under a little bit, I've got some core work going on, I've got some support, and I've actually got a really strong stretch through my hip flexor there, as opposed to there where I'm just hanging. So a bit of support, a little bit of curl under, and that might be a nice way to get people to come into your stretch. Obviously, if they're doing it on the floor, then you want them to go into that gentle tilt forward and then ease. If you want a little bit more quads in that position, you can obviously add on a little bit of a knee bend. I, to be honest, never give this stretch. I don't like it, but I don't like it because it's weighted on the knee, and most people just tend to hang. But it is a stretch that is given quite commonly. The other one that we tend to give quite a lot of is just the knee bend here for quads, but obviously it is a hip flexor stretch if you then add on a little bit of a knee raise. So if you've got your go-to stretches that you like, you can use those, add in ITB or add in a bit of rotation if you want to. Okay, so hip strengthening work. I like footwork on the reformer. I think footwork on the reformer is really good. So what we're trying to get clients to achieve with the footwork on the reformer is basically that they're in a nice line in a position, that they've got their neutral, and that as they're pushing away, that they stay in neutral, and as they're coming in, that they maintain neutral. You can get them to pop their hands on their pubic bone and their heels of their hands on their ASISs, fingertips on their pubic bone, so as they're controlling it in, they stay in that neutral position. Now what people with overactive hip flexors will do, or tight hip flexors, is that they'll pull in this way and they'll be in that tucked under position. So you'll see some air under here, and what we want them to do is let the air out. So you want their sit bones wide. They'll come in a little bit as they push out, but you don't want them to grip, and you want them to feel that they widen their hip bones as they come in. If they are struggling to stay in neutral, I'll use a bolster or a small rolled up towel under their back, and I'll just stay this side of the bolster, so they get the idea of hamstrings extending and hamstrings controlling it. Because what we'll tend to see as well is that we get this, they're using quads, and that's me using my quads as opposed to me using hamstrings to push out, hamstrings to slow the return. So you want them to extend and push out using the back of the legs so this bit stays quiet, and control it as they come in. And you can just do stop, stop, stop. So you get them used to doing work through the back of the legs. Very typically people will do this and they'll curl up. So you'll see them from that neutral position here going and using quads. And if you watch my head, if I'm here, everything stays nice and level. As soon as I start the tip, it's quite a downward pressure in the back of the head, so everything here tenses up, and I'm now pushing into my shoulders. Whereas if I use the back of the legs here, I don't get anywhere as much shoulder pressure, and you can see I've got a little bit of a gap. Whereas if I use my quads and tuck, I'm actually squashing my hand. Okay, so if you do get clients that are in the, they're working and they're saying it hurts my shoulders, just check that they haven't got too much load, so there's not enough load, but also check that they're not using their quads, because that will typically put you into range. So from a heels position, it's more quads. From a toe position, you're actually having to work harder to control the position, and it does become a little bit more quaddy front of the hip as you go onto toes, and then as you go onto these, it starts to become a little bit more inner thighs zip up, a little bit of glutes at the end here. Okay, when you're coming wide, same again. If you're starting on the heels, very good to get a hamstring activation, and then as you go onto toes, you'll find it's a little bit more front of quads. So I would generally, if you can, start them on their heels. Okay. When you're looking at then strength work, what you're trying to get the clients to do is let go. So keep this quiet as you come in. So they get the idea that if they stay in neutral rather than here makes it activate. Okay? If you're then looking at strength work, you can definitely just do that single leg. So what's having to happen is they're having to stay static through that single leg. Okay? Your progression might be they come up and over, or your progression might be that they're doing single leg, or your progression might be that they stay long because they're still having to load it, or your progression might be that they go under the bar and over the bar. So there's a handful of progressions that you can do. And again, if you're just doing the static one, remember you've got inline and you've also got turnout, which will then give them their inner thigh. Okay, so they're your little exercises that can help. The other ones that I quite like is
is just some circles with legs around the thighs. So what you're getting is you can either do up and down without the curl from the pelvis. You're just doing short lever, and get them to relax the legs, otherwise they're on tension with quads. And then we can go into circles and circles the opposite way. So they work really well just in short lever, and really nice if they have sort of back issues as well, or their hamstrings are compromised with feet in straps and they can't quite manage feet in straps. And then we're going to go on to, I can get myself into them. Feet in straps, and I generally start at 90-90 and press out and then control it back in. Push out and then control it back in. The reason I start in bend and stretch is if they are short in hamstrings, they're going to do all sorts there to hold and maintain it. So if they've got an idea where you want them in this section and in frogs first, you can then gently start to get them to stretch within a short range, okay? And think about when you're doing feet in straps, if you're doing the big range of feet in straps, you're looking at mobility and stretch, whereas if you do the short range, here, you're actually looking at hip flexor strength. So that's a really nice one that we forget about for doing hip flexor strength. And remember, we can do that in turn out, anti-clockwise and clockwise, so we can do it parallel, we can do it turn out, and we can do it on turn in. And if you're thinking about your positioning for your feet, in neutral, you're getting middle straps of hamstrings. In turn out, it's the lateral, so whichever way your toes are facing, that's the hamstring that's on the stretch. So if you forget, lateral turn out is giving you outside hamstrings, turn in is giving you medial inside hamstrings. So if you're confused, toes are neutral, it's neutral, toes are out, is out, toes are in, is in. Okay. All right, the only thing I would say with feet in straps, if you are doing bend and stretch and you want them to not fatigue out or not cheat, stop them at 90 because their hamstrings stay active and they push straight back out. Hamstrings stay active. As soon as they come past 90 here, they're likely to tilt. They come into that position, but they've lost active, so they have to come down and then reactivate. Okay, so watch your class if they're doing in and out, that they don't let go and then recruit, let go and then recruit, which looks quite different to working, 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 working. Okay? Okay, so if you have access to a reformer, great. If you don't, or to be honest, I give this to a lot of my clients who don't have reformers, is I use a ball, okay? So if you've done your footwork and you've found that your client's done really well on their footwork and you want to give them an exercise to do at home, I will use the fit ball, okay? So it's the easiest way. I'm just sitting upright to show you, obviously they'd be flat. If you get them on their fit ball and you get them to come in to 90 degrees and press. So if you guys haven't tried it, try it on a fit ball. If you're lying flat and you've got your small head support, if I mimic a head support here, so I can look at you as well. If I just do this, in and out, I get hip flexors, as in superficial ones. If I, however, push down on the ball and maintain that downward pressure, I've now got hamstrings as I push out. Okay, so you can give them as much support as you want to. So if you want them to have full support on the way out and a little bit on the way in, you can. If you want them to challenge a little bit more, you can have them further away and further in. Okay, now the downward pressure means I've got hamstrings and I can press away and I can control it in. I can then do single leg versions if I want to, and I can then do reciprocal. So I'm also training single leg stretch, or I can also starting to train crisscross, or I could look at training double leg stretch. Okay, so it's really nice to get the idea, because what happens when we start going into more loaded mat exercises is that we start to lose the ability to do it. And we could do the same exercises we've been doing on the reformer, and it becomes an exercise for them to do at home. Okay, so they're really good ways to get your client to do it. If they don't have a fit ball, but they do have a magic circle, then you can also do it with your magic circle, where they could do tiny circles, or they could use the magic circle to get hamstrings, to train roll-ups, or prepping to start teaser, or you could use the strap, or you could use the power band. Okay? So with the power band or the strap, I tend to like that a lot for getting them to start to learn your small circles, so the leg circles, bigger leg circles for mobility, as long as they're not losing everything side to side, or just small leg circles where you then decrease the amount of support, but they've also got a little bit to be able to hold. Okay? If you're looking at things like your assisted dead bugs, then obviously you might find, I'll pop up on the reformer so you guys can see a little bit better. If you're looking at things like assisted dead bugs, so they're struggling with the proper dead bug up, you can start them from here. So they've got a short lever, or you could give them a bit of help so they can actually work out giving a bit of, they're resisting hamstrings, so you're trying to stop the strap and you're pushing against the strap rather than pulling. Or you could do it from that position there if you prefer. I like behind the thigh because it allows them to be freer through the leg. So they're just some ideas for you to look at how to start with your hip flexor. We all have our go-tos, we all have our preferred way. I like, from a reformer point of view, I like footwork because they're fully supported. As long as you've got your client in neutral, they'll work quite well. If they're mat clients, or they're people that haven't got access, or that that's not what they're doing and they want to be doing something at home, I like footwork on the fit ball because it works quite well as long as they've got the downward pressure. And also that dead bug, as they improve, then lie them on the roller and get them doing dead bugs on the roller, because it makes them work harder as long as you're confident that you've got the ability to not let that pelvis rock or that pelvis tilt. So we've covered testing hip flexors and or quads, we've covered length in the testing, and we've also covered strength in the testing. We've then also worked out how to maybe release them if they're a bit tight or they're a bit overactive. And if you release them, because you then need to activate them properly,
and get them to work. So if they've been tight and you stretch them, you then want to work them in their new range. If they're overactive because they're weak and they've been working here, you want to get mobility and you want them to retrain them how to use that new mobility. So think about if you are taking something away, that you put something back in to replace it. And that might be that they're tight and they're weak and they're overactive and you need to retrain your hip flexors to work in a new range or strengthen the hip flexors to work in that range. Or it might be that they're compensating for weaker glutes, in which case you'll do the same, but you also need to then activate glutes. So we will cover glutes and glute testing and glute activation and how to check that they're doing that as well, coming up soon. But hopefully you enjoyed that. Any questions? Feel free to post it, and any questions, that's what the Facebook Live will be on. So check out the Facebook Live on Monday. Thanks for watching.